Shalom and welcome to the History of Judaism, the history and story of the Jews. My name is Yossi Silverman. I am a licensed Israeli tour guide and a Jewish educator and licensed Israeli tour guide, and I will be narrating you through the history and story of the Jews today. Some of you might have been expecting this podcast not to be happening if you've been following my various websites and media. I think I advertised the last time that might well be the last podcast unless somebody contributed, and the good news is somebody contributed. So this podcast and quite a number of the next few podcasts are thanks to David Gordon. If you want to contribute to the podcast, please follow the instructions at the end, and remember that this podcast is only possible due to your contribution. So go to Ko-Fi or Patreon, and there'll be also instructions at the end of this podcast. So this podcast is going to focus on the fall of the House of David, or a large part of the fall of the House of David, focusing specifically on the conflict point, the conflagration, the meeting between the two different cultures and empires and kingdoms, the kingdom of Judah and the empire of Babylon. We're going to have a quick recap. Also, I'm going to make a few things clear which I don't think I've been very clear on in past podcasts about the timeline here and what's actually been happening, maybe fill in some gaps. And then we're going to discuss the collision between these two political organisms, as it were. So, the story so far. As we said before, Josiah, a really big turning point in what actually I was reading recently, and somebody called it, Martin Buber, who was a great Jewish thinker, called it the theopolitical moment in history, in Jewish history, would be the death of King Josiah. I mean, really, that's when it all changes, because Josiah makes all these religious and political changes, as we mentioned, not in the last podcast or the podcast before, but the podcast before that. Makes all these great political and religious changes, and then he dies in the Battle of Megiddo by the hand of Pharaoh Necho. And then we mentioned in the podcast, not the last one, but before that, how the people of the land, the Am Haaretz, we had a whole podcast on the Am Haaretz. You should go listen to that if you haven't done, or watch it on YouTube. It's actually a video. It's the Am Haaretz, the people of the land. They appoint Jehoahaz to be the king. This does not go too well, because a big focus of the podcast and my view of the whole situation is of this conflict between Judah and Assyria, and Judah and later on Judah and Babylon, as being really essentially a geopolitical thing. When the prophets are prophesying, they're not just prophesying about religious misdemeanors, they're also making a political commentary on geopolitics. So there's two influences here we mentioned, the influence of Egypt and the influence of Assyria, then later on the influence of Egypt against the influence of Babylon. So Pharaoh Necho takes great offence at the people of the land appointing Jehoahaz, and so Jehoahaz is carried off in chains to Riblah, and then Jehoahaz's brother Jehoiakim, who's previously known as Eliakim, changes his name to Jehoiakim. He replaces Jehoahaz, and he is an Egyptian puppet. This is a bit of a shame for Judah, because they're supporting Egypt, but actually Egypt is not the ascending power at the time, because shortly after this event, Pharaoh Necho goes to fight on behalf of the Assyrian Empire. and is fighting on behalf of the Syrian Empire against the Babylonians, and the Assyrians and Egyptians get a massive whopping, a great beating, a spanking by the Babylonians at the Battle of Carchemish. So then the Babylonians, they have to really place their dominance on the area. And one thing which I don't think I've put into context so much is, why did the Babylonians bother coming here? What's the process that brings the Babylonians to the area of Yehuda, of Judah? Well, it's very simple. Again, to refer back to the podcast that you should really watch or listen to, the one I did during lockdown, my lockdown special, we tried to emphasise the role of the Philistines. Now, I'm sure there's some people here who are like, okay, you're talking about Iron Age 2, you're talking about the era of Yehuda fighting Assyria and then Yehuda fighting Babylon. Why are you bringing up Philistines again? Philistines, that's David, and you haven't really touched on David. And so why are you bothering telling me these stories about the Philistines? Why is it important? It's very important, actually, because the Philistines' whole reason of coming to the Levant, coming to the area of Yehuda, is to subjugate the area, because it's a buffer zone against Egypt, and there are two ethnicities in the area, as we mentioned in the lockdown special. The first ethnicity in the area are the Philistines living in Philistia, and they the evidence seems to point at them being some kind of proxy state almost of the Egyptians. If you go to various different Philistine cities, Jaffa being one of them, or Ashdod being another, there's evidence of Egyptian influence, and also there's even correspondence, ancient correspondence, which was found between the Egyptians and the Philistines, and specifically a king of a place called Afek, which is actually a excavated Tel Afek. So that was a Philistine city. By the way, to know more about another example of a Philistine city, I'd recommend going to my YouTube channel, where I tour around the ancient Philistine city of Gat, also known as Tel Safit. So a different Tel, a different mound, Afek, sends troops to the Egyptians. There's a correspondence about them sending troops to them. So they're the kind of proxy state for the Egyptians. So the Babylonians have to put down the Philistines, and they're going to be a thorn in their side. And if you're going to do that, well, you might as well make sure the Judeans are behaving too. And it's also interesting because I don't know about my reading of the Bible. By the way, if you don't know what I'm talking about, I recommend you do have a quick look at the Bible. I always thought of Judah being the Philistine and the Philistines being on opposing sides. That's not necessarily true for the whole of history, because we see, well, Judah seems to be supporting the Egyptians, and so do the Philistines too, seem to be supporting the Egyptians. Admittedly, Judah seems to vacillate between the Egyptians and the Assyrians, or the Egyptians and the Philistines, and the Egyptians and the Babylonians. So against all this backdrop, the Babylonians are now won the Battle of Carchemish. They're heading to Philistia. They very interestingly, they don't smash. You'd assume the Babylonians would go and smash the place up. No, they don't. They just make sure that the Philistines are aware of who is the new boss in the area. That they're now going to give tribute to the Babylonians and not to Egypt anymore. And this is the first. This is actually recorded in the Chronicles of the Babylonians, the Babylonian Chronicles, which is again another kind of stone chiseled thing that archaeologists found, rather like the the prisms we've mentioned in the past. And it talks about Nebuchadnezzar, the Nebuchadnezzar of the Bible, and how he puts down Philistia, and he goes home and is gearing up to deal with Judah next. So against the backdrop of this, Jeremiah, now I'm going to admit to making an absolute mess up. Jeremiah is not the father-in-law of anybody except for Josiah. I think I said something like he was. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'll re-listen to my podcast. I think I said he was the father-in-law of Jehoiakim. This is not true. It's worse than that. He's the grandfather of Jehoiakim because he's Josiah's father-in-law. So the king's father-in-law prophesies against this. And I think I messed up also the process of Jeremiah being put in his place. So Jeremiah prophesies against the Judeans, telling them they cannot support Egyptians, that they're going to get in a lot of trouble for this. Jehoiakim paying lip service to the Babylonians for a little while, then he goes back to the Egyptians. So this makes the Babylonians very upset. And they head back towards Judah to besiege Jerusalem. Round about the same time, Jeremiah speaks out against this. He writes a scroll. The scroll is read by the king's scribe Baruch ben Neriah in the presence of Jehoiakim the king. Jehoiakim then flies into a rage upon hearing this scroll in front of him and all the people, and tears the scroll into bits with a penknife and throws it in the fire. And Jeremiah runs off and hides. Babylonians come, and they're heading towards it to siege Jerusalem when Jehoiakim dies and leaves his son Jehoiachin in charge. Now, one of the things I think the reason why he actually flies into such a crazy rage is he probably recognises that Jeremiah is probably good for his word here, is probably right, and that's why he gets so angry. Anyway, Jehoiachin is left in charge, or Konia as is known. The Babylonians come and they make their first, if I'm not mistaken, siege of Jerusalem. Get into the city, they carry away Jehoiachin, then they carry away the court. Jehoiachin is carried away in chains back to Riblah as well. They've taken Riblah. Riblah is now one of their cities. After this, they place their own puppet king in charge, an uncle of Jehoiachin, meaning a brother of Jehoiakim, meaning another grandson of Jeremiah, called Mattaniah, who changes his name to Zedekiah, the righteousness of God, and said, which is very strange because he carries on the trajectory of his brother. He rebels again, supports Egypt. I believe it's not actually clear that Babylon really is gonna be that ascendant. Really, Jeremiah is thrown in a pit. And I think I described it last time, just not particularly accurate. He's thrown in a cistern, and his legs sink down into the mud of this cistern. And it's very, he sits in the pit, in the cistern, prophesying until he is rescued by a eunuch of the king called Ebed Melech, possibly a Ethiopian eunuch. He gets him out. And he gets, after the fact, very sensible servant, tacit support of the king, who's like, oh no, some evil courtiers threw Jeremiah into a cistern, of course, completely against my ruling, and Jeremiah runs off again. And we're left with Zedekiah, where we're going to leave it now. Zedekiah then left waiting for the impending doom. So, just to put some clearness into what's happened. Briefly from Josiah dying again, we've got Jehoahaz taking over, Jehoahaz being replaced by Jehoiakim, Jehoiakim ruling until he rebels. Then he goes back against the Babylonians. Then he goes back to Then he supports the Babylonians. Then he goes back to supporting the Egyptians. The Babylonians come over. Joachim dies. Joachim takes over, who's then carried off by the Babylonians, leaving Zedekiah. That's where we are right now. And Zedekiah is left waiting for the impending doom, which we're going to deal with next time. We're going to focus on the actual destruction of Jerusalem next time. But now what we're really dealing with, to make it clear, this is the end anyway. It's the end anyway because the most of the nobles have been carried away from Jerusalem. That's what we're left at. And we've got Zedekiah left with like a skeleton crew controlling the city. And he's also on the same trajectory. There's I think one of the problems is thinking there's going to be a crazy twist in this story. There's not really going to be a crazy twist on the story. But what I think we need to do is to zoom out and to look at the different parties involved. We've discussed a lot the kings themselves. We've discussed a lot the people of the land. We've discussed the prophets. What we haven't discussed is who is actually coming their way, who is crawling towards Judea. So who are the Babylonians? So, as you know, most people know, we're talking about a Mesopotamian empire who lived between the Tigris and the Euphrates. They are rising up on the bones of the Assyrian Empire. And in my opinion, I could do a really, really modest job at describing them. Personally, I just suggest if you're really interested, go and listen to Dan Carlin's King of Kings podcast. He does an amazing explanation of who precisely are the Babylonians and who precisely are the Assyrians. My remit is to explain how they affect the growth of the Jews. So back to Babylon. Babylon, to give you a brief summary, which I think Dan Carlin will do a better job on, the Babylonians really are a kingdom before Assyria starts their rise with Tiglath-Pileser and Sargon II. And they're also an empire afterwards as well. They're just one that's constantly being kept in check by the Assyrians. There's always, the Babylonians somewhere hanging around there in the background until Sennacherib, same guy we've been talking about over the last few podcasts, the Assyrian, comes and allegedly destroys Babylon. There's no archaeological evidence of this. It's supposed to have flooded Babylon and turned it into a swamp and said, well, that's that. Nothing more is happening with Babylon this time. Again, that's not really necessarily a historical reality. Yes, it's true to say to a certain extent Babylon and Assyria are very similar. They both speak Aramaic. There's a discussion of the Aramicization, the making Aramaicness of of the Babylonian culture. They're dominated by a ethnicity in the south of the region. I'll hopefully get a map for you. I'm terrible at that. Hopefully get you a map. They're dominated by this ethnicity in the south called the Chaldeans. But it's a very heterogeneous area, really, with all these different groups, the Medes, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and they're kind of all mixed together. So, as we said, Babylonians power in its own right. They really have it out for the Assyrians. They get fed up with Assyrian rule. The first go at this actually is within the Assyrian monarchy itself. One of the major Assyrian emperors in the past was a guy called Esarhaddon, and he has a massive civil war with his brother Shamash-shum-ukin. Esarhaddon is the emperor of Assyria, and Shamash-shum-ukin was the emperor of Babylon. So that was very much always this Babylon versus Assyria motif was something very much always there. And then finally, a group of kingdoms within the Assyrian Empire, led by Babylon, rebel against Assyria and gain control. And again, all the time being led by Babylon. One of the big differences between Babylon and Assyria is the Assyrians, as the name implies, Ashurim in Hebrew, worship Ashur, which is their specific local god. The Babylonians, they worship their own special god called Marduk, maybe Muraduk. If you're familiar with the story of the book of Esther, which has a whole load of historical problems with, I'm not going to go into. The interesting thing that there are the names, because one of the protagonists in that story is called Mordechai. Mordechai contains the name of the Babylonian god Marduk. So Marduk, they are the pro-Marduk people. If you think this isn't to do with religion, you're sorely wrong. Because one thing to really understand about this whole story is it's not about conquest. It's about control. It's a kind of ancient, almost absolutism. Control, absolute power, but this is absolute power represented by tax and tribute of the sub-kingdoms. The sub-kingdoms see this emperor as the king of kings, the highest king, who they almost respect and almost worship, and they do this by tax and tribute. We don't have modern communications. You can't have the Babylonian secret police hiding, bugging everybody's bedrooms. Instead, you've got to have people giving lip service, saying you are the king, giving lots of money and gold and stuff, and behaving. Not this kind of modern totalitarianism. Get that out of your head. Don't think of some crazy despot, because they can't be, because they're all the way over in Babylon when we're dealing with a situation in Judah. They're in Iraq. This is in Israel, and it's not next to each other. I know, unfortunately, some people do think we're next to each other. We're not that close. One similarity between the ancient absolutism and the modern totalitarianism, at least between the Soviets to a certain extent and the Assyrians and Babylonians, was this concept of population transfer. You had this thing where if Stalin wanted to control a group, he would pick them up and take them from where they were and drag them all the way inside Russia to places like Siberia and the eastern coast of Russia. He did this with Jews. He did this with peoples around the Caucasian area. He did this with ethnic Koreans. They do a similar thing, is that they don't have the resources to take every single person in an area and move them. They take the elite. So they'll take an elite of Judah and bring them all the way into Babylon. It's possible the Assyrian Empire did this with the 10 tribes. As we mentioned, there's a division between one Jewish kingdom, or one kingdom of ethnically homogenous people called the Judeans, and their other ethnic homogenous state was Israel. So two kingdoms, the kingdom of the north, yes, very Game of Thrones, as we said before, Israel, and the southern kingdom of Judah. And Sargon is supposed to have taken away the 10 tribes of Israel, but what does that actually mean? We're not sure, because it's very difficult to have taken absolutely everybody away. Most likely took away the elite, and everybody else ran south to their brothers in Judah. Why do they keep coming in? Why did this Babylon keep coming? And we'll put one siege, and then we'll take your one king away, then we'll come back. So it's all to do with control. It's to do. You don't want to wipe out a land, and they pretend they like to think they wipe out a land. I mean, Sennacherib says he's wiped out Babylon. Has he really? That's a question. I think it's more to do with control. You can say you've wiped them out. Sennacherib never conquered Jerusalem, but he certainly says as we said in the podcast, a number of podcasts ago, he left Jerusalem as a bird locked in a cage on his chronicles, and that's clearly also a method of control, telling people how scary you are, regardless of whether you've done it or not. Also, it's another example of control. You go to the Assyrian palaces, they've got all these battle scenes on the walls, and I believe the Babylonians are similar. They have these battle scenes on the walls showing how strong they are. The massive statues that you have in Babylonian palaces, and some of them very strange, the kind of bearded men with wings, images of gods and things. That's all to humble the person who's there. I think I have a picture on my Instagram of me standing at the gates of, I think, Nineveh in the British Museum. And I look tiny compared to these massive winged bearded statues. And again, that's to do with control. What's all this control for? What's the Babylonian angle? And this you really have to understand the story. And a amazing historian by the name of Bickerman explains it as being connected with an intense Babylonian idea of a sense of justice. That the Babylonians, firstly, they feel they are fulfilling the will of their god Marduk. In all their writings in the Chronicles, which people have managed to read, it explains that the Babylonians really believe they're fulfilling the will of God, and also they give people fair warning. They'll come, they'll besiege Jerusalem how many times before they'll finally destroy it? That's because they're giving warnings, they're making the sense of justice. You don't just come in the first time round, kill everybody, drag everybody away, destroy the town. Apart from anything else, you're not going to get any taxes. You come in, you make threats, you explain that everybody has to behave, everybody has to fulfill the will of God, and if they don't, they'll come and they'll destroy the place. And then they do it. And also they don't... Destruction is an interesting idea. They more likely, when they come to a place, they destroy temples. They don't destroy the idols inside. The idols were taken back to Babylon, where they would be put in a kind of incarceration in the temple of their god. It's possible they had a very Olympian, very Greek way of thinking of gods, where these gods, they had personalities. They'd sit down with each other and they'd play backgammon. And so, once you'd conquered one country, you'd have to, as well as taking the king away in chains, you'd take the god away in chains, and he'd have to sit with your god for the rest of eternity, where your god, drank beer and made fun of him. It was probably a little bit strange when they finally took the temple in Jerusalem. We'll discuss what's the deal with that later. And it's replaced as well in Jewish sources, in biblical sources. Jeremiah talks about the justice which is going to be meted out on the people of Judah by God through the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. So again, it's this idea of justice. You do something wrong, the gods will punish you through the intermediary of an actual king, a foreign king. On the other hand, you have this extension of Judean political power through what could be ostensibly Assyrian and then Babylonian methods. You see the example of some kind of tax or produce collection for a tithe in archaeological sites. The Lamelech jugs, if we mentioned before, it was there possibly collection jugs. Also, you have the growth of large palaces, the growth of large castles. You see the growth of Judean political control, which then I think there's this kind of almost an idea that, you rise so high and so high in politics. The question has to be, when are you going to fall? Are you going to fall? Are you going to meet something to stop you? And that's what the Babylonians represent, that the thing which is going to stop the rise of the Davidic dynasty. So what are we left with? We're left with a fight over control. We're left with Zedekiah, and the question is Zedekiah going to be good? Is he going to follow the control of the kings of Babylon? Does he believe that the kings of Babylon really have control this time because the Assyrian Empire has just fallen? Or is the Egyptian Empire going to be the next one? And one thing I like to finish on is it's very easy in hindsight to say, what on earth was Zedekiah doing rebelling again? Hadn't he seen his brother being taken down by the Babylonians, then his nephew? Well, actually, how long has the kingdom of Egypt last for? What are you going to do? You're going to go with a new startup company, or you're going to go with the old faithful Egyptian empire? So the next podcast, we are going to burn down the kingdom of Judea. Thank you very much for listening. I've now been able to, through kind donations, especially from David Gordon, fund the hosting on SoundCloud, which in my opinion is the best option for podcasting for this podcast. However, I am still working menial labour on archaeological digs, and I'm still working also in childcare when the digs aren't going on. I work as a kindergarten assistant, and I'm proud of that. Kindergarten, I believe society would fall apart were it not for kindergarten assistants. But this does not leave me with great time and resources for the production of podcasts. The sound quality is connected to the fact I've still been using the same not exactly high standard microphone for the past few years. That needs to be replaced. But more essential than that is the issue that I have to pay bills. So if you want to support the podcast in the future, it would be helpful for you to either do one of the following things. If you want to do something free, subscribe right now on SoundCloud, or leave a good report on iTunes, or absolutely go to my YouTube channel and click subscribe there. You can also see extra videos which are connected to the podcast, and also tour guiding in the political system in Israel and all these very interesting things. Please click subscribe on my YouTube channel, and also in order to stay afloat, you can contribute through going to ko-fi.com/ScoutIsrael, or patreon.com/ScoutIsrael. Who knows, you might be named in the next podcast. Thank you for listening. You've been a great audience, and this has been the history of Judaism.